All right, so this morning we're going to begin with another story about my rescue dog, Selah. I think I have a picture here for you. There she is. The stuffed animal she has there was a birthday gift for my youngest daughter, Macy, from her best friend. That birthday gift lived unharmed for, I want to say, maybe about 12 hours before its left eyeball was opened up and all the stuffing removed. You remember some time ago, I mentioned to you that Selah had eaten the seats in our Ford Explorer, and that she was becoming a bit of a significant menace in my life, and right on the verge of becoming a deep regret. Good news is she's come a long way. Truthfully, she's started taking hemp and CBD oil, so she's a bit of a drug addict at this point. But it's helping, so we're not too disappointed with that. And the other day, I got a new toy for her. Now, I'm reluctant to disclose the name of this apparatus because it's, I don't know, I suppose somewhat awkward or embarrassing for me, and it may be uncomfortable for you, the audience, to hear the name of this. But I feel you knowing the name will help with the rest of the story. So I reluctantly confess to you that the name of the dog toy that I recently purchased for my dog is called a flirt pole. Or, alternatively, if you prefer, a tease pole. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Yeah. And I don't have this in my notes, but I asked Chantel, my wife, to go into the pet store and ask the gentleman if they sold those. He was as uncomfortable as she was by the whole thing. So you can go to the next picture, I think, Brianna. So this is a flirt pole. If you've ever had a cat, you've got the feathers or whatever at the end of the little pole. Well, they now have them for dogs. And the idea is it's a retractable pole, and you can tether like a ball or a rope to the end of it. And then you can stand stationary and, of course, throw the toy to and fro, and the dog runs frantically in circles and burns off a lot of energy. Now, this is not the easiest thing to use right out of the package. So the other day I had a moment of inspiration. I thought, I'm going to try to get the hang of this thing with Selah. Now, ideally, you would use the flirt pole outside, but it was cold, so I decided to practice in the living room. Now, the decision led to minimal space being available for any necessary maneuvering that would be required on my part. But I felt I could handle the limitations of the indoor arena. So after only a couple minutes of using this gadget, I found myself in sort of a sweet spot of swinging and snapping this tethered rubber ball at the end of the pole all over the room. I was feeling pretty good about my prowess, I suppose. I got a little bit cocky. Not sure exactly what I did, but I managed to swing and snap the ball so hard that it came flying like on a perfect line and connected squarely with my face, which stung considerably. It knocked my glasses all crooked. I had to check for blood. My eyes were watering. It was not good. And additionally, or perhaps maybe more unfortunately, my youngest daughter, Macy, who's 12, was sitting at the kitchen table in a perfect front row seat for this whole demonstration. Now, midway through the recital, prior to the face smash, Macy announced from this front row seat, "Dad, you look like a lion tamer." I do look like a lion tamer, I thought to myself as I commanded this thing all over the room. Now, I can't imagine how Macy's heart became swollen with pride as she watched her nearly 40-year-old father, adorned in his best sweatpants, spin and snap and sidestep while the rubber ball and the dog dance along in jubilation. Beautiful grace and motion, I'm convinced, until, of course, the loud and abrupt end where the ball hit my face is sort of a request for me to please stop. The dog hair settles, my vision corrects, and my first thought was, I didn't see that coming. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Those truths about Jesus that may be like a rubber ball to the face. Those truths we didn't see coming. And they slap us and they alert us and we become aware of something maybe we didn't know. Now, as we've learned through this series, Mark's gospel has a lot to say about seeing. We talked at length about this last week as we jumped into Mark 8. Jesus asks the disciples, you may remember coming off the feeding of the 4,000, he says, "Do you have eyes but fail to see?" As they don't understand what he's saying. And then immediately following Jesus' discussion on eyes but not seeing, Mark records this account of Jesus restoring the sight of a blind man at Bethsaida, and he does it in a two-stage process on purpose to do sort of a live action parable for the disciples so that they would know that their understanding, their vision, their sight of who Jesus is would also be a process. There were truths up ahead that they didn't know were coming, and Jesus wanted them to know that it would be a bit of a process. Now, we know the disciples following Jesus, right from their start all the way to his resurrection, included all sorts of things: amazement and surprise and devastation and even jubilation. And these experiences of these first followers teach us that living as a student of Jesus is full of surprises, and sometimes it's even full of super shocks, those moments we don't see coming. Not in our wildest dreams, and not even in what we think is our best theology. And so today we're going to finish in Mark chapter 8. We're going to conclude this chapter, which is so important to the whole gospel. And we're going to pick up in verse 27. So if you want to follow in your own text, Mark 8, we'll begin in 27. So we're picking up right where we left off. Jesus has restored the sight of the man at Bethsaida in this two-stage process. And then Mark picks it up in verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So I've mentioned that Mark chapter 8 is the swing in which this entire gospel moves. Jesus has been amazing everyone for the first half of this gospel, but now we swing. And Jesus and the disciples begin a journey to Jerusalem and to his crucifixion. And this journey, as many journeys do, begins with a question. In fact, two questions on this day. Jesus asks, "Who do the people say I am?" And he asks, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" There's much to be said and considered about these questions. I've spoken on this in this church before. So for this morning, as we get going, what I want you to see isn't so much the answers that the disciples are giving, at least not yet. We're going to get into that. But I want you to see that when Jesus asks these questions, he's doing something unique. He's asking the disciples to make a judgment about him in the midst of the journey, not at the end of it. Right in the thick of it, right in the middle. And so we see, Mark tells us, on the way, he asks the question. On the way, he says, "Who do people say I am?" John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter answers, "You're the Messiah." While they were on the way, Jesus asks for their judgment. Who am I? It's right in the middle of the journey, not when all the questions are answered. It's not when all the proof of who he is. This isn't post-resurrection. Everything is not clear and available to them yet. They're in the middle. They're on their way, and Jesus says, "Who am I?" He doesn't ask these questions post-trial, post-crucifixion. It's in the thick of it. In fact, it's interesting to think that Mark's gospel, chapter 8, is the center. Right in the middle of the whole thing is when Jesus asks this question. And this experience of answering or confessing in the middle of the journey isn't just for the disciples, it's for all of us. You know, faith is ultimately a judgment about Jesus in the midst of the journey. And then it's a willingness to act on that judgment in the face of all the other possible judgments. Jesus asks, who do the people say I am? What are the opinions floating out there? And what about you? Who do you say I am? What's the judgment, even amongst all the other possible judgments? Faith is to say, I believe Jesus is this, and he's not that, and I'm going to live as if that's true, even if I don't have the whole picture yet. And so Peter, answering Jesus' question on behalf of the group, he gives the right answer. He says, you are the Messiah. And this is significant, both in the confession, but also because no human has yet said this about Jesus in Mark's gospel. This is the first human to utter these words. God has said it, even demons have said it, but no human has yet said, you are the Messiah. And so this is a significant confession. Now, of course, you know that the title Messiah is not just a fancy nickname that Jesus gave Peter. The Messiah was a specific and long-expected character in the Jewish faith. From the very beginning of the Bible, we actually find people waiting for the Messiah. And so to connect to something I said last week, this is another reason that we cannot understand Jesus apart from also the Old Testament. Because all of the description of the Messiah comes through the Old Testament. The Messiah is actually not a New Testament character in and of itself, isolated. He's a character that you're going to find in a second shows up in the first chapters of Genesis. We start hearing about the Messiah. And it carries all the way through, all the way to when Jesus of Nazareth, this tradesman, shows up. And, you know, we sing about Jesus Messiah. We do this here. But I'm not sure we really even all know what that means. What is Jesus Messiah? And I think it's worthwhile for all of us, those of us who are maybe new in the faith, maybe those of us who've been in the faith a long time, but just never really had anybody explain this to you, to take a moment to go, what is the Messiah? Who is the Messiah? And what is Peter saying when he says this? So, to do this, we're going to turn to our friends at the Gospel Project who put together these fantastic videos and save pastors like me a lot of time. So this is about a 5-minute video. This is going to give you a full picture of who and what the Messiah is. So there you go. There's a fairly concise, well-articulated description of the Messiah. It's a tremendous confession that Peter makes then. For him and the other disciples to say, we believe that you are the long-promised and often prophesied rescuer, finally here. But the full truth of who the Messiah is and what he would be was still unclear, and this video touches on it. They believed that Jesus was a rescuing king. They'd seen him do amazing things, heal people, cast out demons, authority over nature. They'd seen all kinds of amazing things, but it was still unclear on what type of king or Messiah he would be. Something that they didn't see coming was still ahead. And so Peter's confession, you are the Messiah, paired with what he didn't see coming, invites us to consider this morning that right confession doesn't equate to full understanding. Peter said, you're the Messiah, and he was bang on. He was absolutely right. But he was also wrong at the same time. Verse 31, Jesus, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man, character from Daniel, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and 3 days later rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So Peter gives this confession on behalf of the group. And then, right after that confession, Jesus begins to teach them more than about who he is. You're the Messiah. You're right. Let me tell you some more about me. And in verse 32, Mark tells us that Jesus spoke plainly. The Greek would also suggest like frankness, even boldness about his suffering and his rejection and his crucifixion. And this is obviously, this plainness that Jesus uses is a stark contrast to these hard to understand parables that we find elsewhere in the Gospels. Jesus speaks plainly, not in disguise, so to speak. And by speaking plainly, Jesus is making sure that no one fails to really hear what he's saying about his suffering and his death. This was something that he told them plainly. And Jesus' plain description of what was to happen causes quite a response in Peter. This fisherman, now follower of Jesus, who has just confessed, "You're the Messiah." Because Peter doesn't see death and suffering coming. So Mark tells us Peter pulls Jesus aside. You know, the one-on-one conversation. We all love these people. But based on Jesus' response, which we're going to get shortly, it seems Peter is saying something here that Jesus doesn't really like. Something probably like, Jesus, we know you're better than that. Quit being so negative. We know you've got better plans than that. You're stronger than that. We believe you're going to do more than that. We believe in you. Don't be a quitter. Talk victoriously, Christ. Peter wants to put an end to this negative talk. Now the question we ask is, why does Peter rebuke Jesus right after he said, "You're the Messiah"? The first human to say this, and now he's correcting Jesus when Jesus speaks plainly about what the Messiah has to do. And the answer, and you may have already figured this out, is because Peter never expects the promised Messiah to suffer and die at the hands of Israel's enemies. Never saw it coming. Peter had eyes to see the Messiah, but there was lots he could not see. And so Peter and countless others are expecting a Messiah like King David, who, like David, would defeat the enemies of Israel, in this case the Romans or the Jewish leaders who were in cooperation with them, and restore Israel to a place of freedom and even glory. Peter expects this Messiah to defeat Romans, not die on their heinous torture tree. And so though Peter knows Jesus was God's answer, in his vision of God's answer, there's no place for suffering and death. And it teaches us that a person can confess Jesus is the Messiah, but that doesn't necessarily know that that person knows anything about Jesus the Messiah. For example, I can stand before you today and I can confess, and I Googled this, by the way, Sweden has a king named Carl Gustaf. I don't know anything about him. I had to Google him. But I know he's Sweden's king. I can tell you he's the anointed one of Sweden. But if I want to know more about this King Gustaf, I'm going to have to look into what he does or what he's been doing. I have to look at what he's been saying, what he says. And likewise, coming to fully understand Jesus as Messiah comes by really paying attention to what he's saying, especially the plain stuff, and what he's doing and has done, and then receiving all of it, not cherry-picking what we like and what we don't. The parts that, jive with our personal preferences, or the details that give us what we want, but don't really interfere too much with our life or our family plans, or our hobbies. We can confess Jesus is Messiah and completely refuse to allow that confession to change anything about the way we live. See, church, a confession of identity only takes us so far with people, especially with Jesus. Peter says you're the Messiah, but he also rebukes Jesus for hearing the type of Messiah that Jesus said he was. And when we really boil Peter's struggle down right into the humanity of this, what we find is that Peter is counting on changed circumstances for himself and Israel, his people. What Peter wasn't expecting was salvation from sin for the entire world by way of the Messiah's suffering and death. And so when Jesus begins to say, I'll die for you and for your sin, rather than changing Israel's immediate circumstance, Peter's shocked and even offended because he never saw it coming. And he seemed to feel that he had more pressing needs than salvation from sin. And before we shake our heads at silly Peter and his confession with no understanding, we probably need to look at ourselves in the mirror for a moment too. How many of us have been tempted to walk away from the faith when our circumstance wasn't changed? How many of us have walked away from the faith a time or two or three or four? I tend to almost walk away from the faith on Tuesdays. Dead serious. Tuesdays are hard for me. How many of us have walked away when we feel God didn't do what we asked? How many of us have seen loved ones walk away from the Messiah when he didn't vanquish the enemy of bad circumstances the way that we expected he would? How many of us have been shocked and walked away from the confession, you are the Messiah, when Jesus said very plainly to us, I've suffered for your sin, but I'm not going to change that circumstance? Common story. New Testament commentator Mark Strauss says something really helpful, I think, to understanding our habits like this. He says that our perceptions of Jesus are inevitably shaped by our felt needs. Our perceptions of Jesus are inevitably shaped by our felt needs. What he's observing is what people think they need most is often what they then expect the Messiah to do. And that's why Jesus tells Peter in verse 33, get behind me, Satan, you don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Said to Pastor Brianne this morning as I was chewing on this text one last time, I said, if anyone else told us that our concerns were merely human, we'd be so offended. You're not worrying about the things God's worrying about. You're worrying about the things that you want to worry about. How dare you? This is serious. Peter's version of the Messiah was built from his own concern rather than God's. They were merely human. As challenging as that is, as maybe as uncomfortable that is to hear. And we're living at a time when no one thinks they're sinful. I suspect if I took 25 or 30 minutes to really lay out for this room how sinful I am and you are, I'd probably offend someone. We're living in a time when so many, even in church, don't believe they need God's forgiveness for their wretchedness. Therefore, our immediate expectations of the Messiah may not be that Jesus justifies us before a holy God. It's that I'm having a bad day and I'm too stressed and do something, God. And so this morning it's worth inviting you to consider what type of perceptions of Jesus, Messiah, have your immediate needs created. For Peter, it was this political and economic liberator. Peter believed Jesus was a king, no problem, but not a suffering and crucified one. He wasn't okay with that. What about us? What need in our life is shaping our perception of Jesus? What type of Messiah do we think this tradesman from Nazareth is? No doubt the answers are many. Common, probably we'd share some, but many. And whatever it is, whatever that perception is, Jesus wants to correct it. That's why he corrects Peter. And not just to be hard on us or super rigid, but because he wants our confession to match who he really is. Jesus thought it was worthwhile to tell his disciples about this, who he really is. We're going to bring this message to a close here. This isn't a particularly long one this morning. But I want to hang in this consideration as our kind of final place. Because I want to think about our immediate needs and how those inform the perceptions of Jesus, the Messiah, for just a moment longer. So Jesus warned the people that they could have eyes but fail to see the type of Messiah he is. And church, that is not just for them. Every one of us is capable of having eyes to see but will not really see it. Through his rebuke of Peter, Jesus invites us to explore if we might be too busy considering our own world, our own little internal kingdom, and what we want to gain. Are we obsessed and consumed with what Jesus calls merely human concerns? Jesus as a suffering Messiah is something Peter and the others did not see coming. And today I'm not sure that we're that much better. We love Jesus, the amazing circumstance-changing King. We say he's not a genie, but we kind of wish he was. And I do want to say this because it's important. Jesus changes circumstances. He healed the sick. He restored sight to the blind. He raised the dead. He invited the lonely in. He extended grace to the outcast. I mean, if you encountered Jesus on a bad, awful day, you felt better. So don't get me wrong. Of course he changes our circumstances. But that mentality becomes a problem when Jesus is primarily or even exclusively seen as the circumstance changer more than he is the suffering Savior for human souls. This is why Jesus goes on to say in the next section, you can gain the world and lose your soul. What will it profit you, he says. And then he goes further and he says, and what can you possibly in your life pay to buy your justification, essentially? Nothing. And you see, church, as uncomfortable as it might be to admit, we don't always understand the Jesus who relinquished everything for the sake of God's concern, because we have a hard time not being very concerned with ourselves. And if we're being honest, our immediate needs being met, our desires being satisfied, our hard work finally paying off and getting that vacation or that vacation home or that new toy, or our bank accounts getting fat, or our family bringing us more joy. All of our earthly troubles being controlled and eradicated. I want Friday every day. Those human concerns are so often treated as a greater value than your sins being forgiven. If not in confession, at least in day-to-day practice. Remember, Jesus was going to die for Peter's sinful soul, to forever bring him into perfect relationship with God and make him forever a citizen of his kingdom, to rule and reign alongside Jesus in his glory. But Peter just mostly wanted the Romans crushed and an easier life. If an easy life is what we are hoping for and expecting to find in this Messiah, we will be disappointed. He's not that kind of Messiah. But if our soul's salvation is more worth than the whole world to us, then it is true, as Jesus says, through him we gain everything. It's upside down and it's hard to understand. But as Dane Ortland says, and I like this little sentence, he says, glad abandon, that's of course to Jesus, is our only sanity. Glad abandon. How many abandon gladly? Glad abandon to God's concerns is our only sanity. But you know as well as I do, this is not the sanity of the world. Most of us would rather go insane worrying about our own concerns than finding sanity in glad abandon. The world did not and it does not anticipate and look for heroes and saviors who bleed and die at the hands of their enemies. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, these guys die early. The comic books don't become what they are. We like saviors who don't really bleed much, don't really die, who keep going and always win. Jesus wins by death. The King of Kings was wounded. The King of Kings was rejected by those that should have known better. The King of Kings was crucified by empire and religion. This is the Son of Man. This is the Son of God. This is the Messiah. The King of Kings became the criminal of criminals so that the criminals can live and rule with him as a king forever. May we not, in an attempt to let ourselves off of our crosses that we call human concerns, attempt in our own hearts and minds to redefine who Jesus is and what he came to do. But instead, may we find ourselves abandoned to the concerns of God, the work of the suffering King, in who we find a depth of life that is truly unimaginable and everlasting, and it's something that we never saw coming. Amen.